Hello, and thank you for your interest in the MLK Community Art Project. This educational video will provide you with a brief overview of Dr. Martin Luther King's biography and personal philosophy, some historical context, and an exploration of the civil rights movement, alongside some examples of contemporary advocacy and strategies for becoming more engaged in your own community. While putting this resource together, we strove to recognize the complexity of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and the historical context in which his advocacy emerged. Because we know this information is not exhaustive, we hope that it provides you with some helpful information that can be incorporated or inspire your creative submissions, and we encourage you to learn more about these topics. You can visit www.communitiesfirstinc.org to view the educational material in written form, see the artist prompts, and view the additional guidelines for submission instructions. We're looking forward to seeing your creative works and encourage everyone, regardless of your perceived skill level, your age, or your favorite mode of creative expression, to submit your works. I'm now going to turn it over to Robin, who will give you a brief overview of MLK's biography.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia, the second of three children. King's father, Michael King Sr., and maternal grandfather were also ministers. King grew up and attended segregated schools in Atlanta. Public schools, along with public and private facilities across the United States, were segregated legally until 1968. Segregation was both a legal and social practice that required individuals to be separated because of the color of their skin. The following example of legal and social segregation is taken from King's childhood. When he was just 6 years old, he became friends with a white child who lived across the street from him. They both went to separate schools. One went to a school for all blacks and one went to a school for all whites. However, when the child parents found out about the friendship between King and the child, they were told that they could no longer be friends. King continued to experience racial discrimination, but he excelled in school. He attended Booker T. Washington High School. It was the upper level school in the city that was open to African Americans before enrolling at Morehouse College at 15. While at Morehouse College, the college president, Benjamin Mays, became King's mentor and strengthened his interest in ministry and religious theology. King ultimately graduated with a bachelor's of arts in sociology from Morehouse College and a bachelor's in divinity from Crowther's Theological Seminary. Finally, he received his doctorate from Boston University in 1955, where he met his wife, Coretta Scott King. That year expanded his work as social activist. King helped coordinate the Montgomery bus boycotts and strengthen his work by collaborating with other activists. He also was the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a civil rights organization. In 1957, King officially changed his name to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and continued to strengthen his leadership in the civil rights movement by advocating for racial justice and workers' rights. Some of his most famous milestones include his efforts in the Birmingham campaign, a collective effort focused on highlighting racial segregation and racial injustice. King was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, and from his cell, he wrote the Letter from Birmingham Jail, one of his most famous calls to end violence of racism. In the same year, 1963, King also gave his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. now considered one of the most famous speeches in American history. His speech painted a version of an American that recognized the importance and value of all, as well as fully dismantle oppression structures like racism. Martin Luther King Jr. continued to address complex issues relating to racial and social justice, including voting rights at the Selma March, the Vietnam War, and the consequences of poverty through the Poor People's Campaign. However, King was assassinated on April 4, 1968, at the age of 39. Just days after his death, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed discrimination, reinforced the right to vote, and desegregated all facilities, including the public school system that King had attended. Following his death, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. continued to influence the fight for social justice in the United States and abroad. King won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, one of the most notable international recognitions. He continued to be recognized after his death with the creation of his monument in Washington, D.C., and in 2011, the federal recognition of MLK Day, a national day of service.
Thank you, Robin, and I'll now be talking briefly about Dr. King's personal philosophy. So Martin Luther King Jr. combined Mahatma Gandhi's teachings about nonviolent resistance with his own understanding of compassionate Christianity. King called individuals to continue to love their neighbors while also challenging injustice. So what is nonviolent resistance? Nonviolent resistance is a strategy that brings attention to a particular issue a group believes needs to change. King and other members of the civil rights movement used nonviolent resistance to bring attention to racism and racial injustice in the United States. Through their activism, members of the civil rights movement challenged laws as well as social attitudes that perpetuated bias and the unfair treatment of people of color. Activists participating in nonviolent resistance refused to be violent when protesting or demonstrating, even when they were met with violence at the hands of police officers or counter-protesters. Demonstrations like marches and sit-ins are examples of nonviolent resistance. Civil disobedience is another example of nonviolent resistance. However, civil disobedience specifically calls people to challenge unjust laws. King drew distinctions between a just and unjust law based off of his understanding of what was morally right and wrong. King believed laws like segregation are examples of racial injustice and are fundamentally wrong because they were intended to harm people of color. However, King's approach to civil disobedience also often required individuals who were peacefully protesting unjust laws to still accept the consequences of breaking them. In many cases, this involved being arrested. King believed that this would show how much activists truly respected the law, while also bringing attention to the harm that results from unjust laws. Using an example from King's own life, we'll see how these concepts operate in practice. So in 1964, MLK and others were arrested for going to a restaurant and asking to be served by staff as they would white patrons. As we've learned previously, laws separating people on the basis of race are examples of segregation and extended beyond businesses like restaurants into classrooms and between neighborhoods. By asking to be served in the restaurant, activists were engaging in civil disobedience by directly challenging a law they considered to be unjust, and nonviolent resistance by engaging in a sit-in and refusing to respond with violence. King believed that compassion could be used as a tool for justice, and he believed that nonviolence would allow the movement to educate individuals, specifically those who were prejudiced themselves, to see the realities of racial injustice, build a greater understanding between different people, as well as ultimately dismantle oppressive systems like racism. King is notable because he believed that challenging racism would take both courage and significant levels of compassion. He believed this approach would help folks understand how others' lived experiences and perspectives formed while creating space for individuals to have open conversations about how beliefs, specifically one's biases and prejudices, are inherently harmful to their fellow neighbors. Now that we've been able to learn more about Dr. King as an individual, we'll learn about the historical context in which his advocacy emerged. So the civil rights movement began in the mid-1950s but continued into the 1960s. Broadly, the movement sought to challenge and dismantle complex social, economic, and political issues. Through collective action, the movement began to bring attention to racial discrimination and injustice, address segregation, and more. To provide helpful context to the critical role the civil rights movement played in advancing social justice, this section will briefly review key historical moments as they relate to racial inequality. This list is not exhaustive, and we encourage you to learn more about the United States' involvement in slavery, the American Civil War, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow era. So, the year 1619 marks the first ship carrying enslaved people from Africa to Virginia. But the practice of enslaving individuals began nearly a century earlier with this enslavement of Native peoples. Legalized slavery continued for over 200 more years and allowed dehumanization and violence towards people of color. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million enslaved individuals living in the United States. For perspective, that's nearly half of the people living in Michigan today. Following the American Civil War in 1865, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were made to the Constitution. Known collectively as the Civil War Amendments, these are recognized as monumental, though imperfect, steps towards racial justice. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment extended citizenship to all formerly enslaved people and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment afforded Black men the right to vote. While people had been granted important rights, and the first Black men were elected to public office between 1865 and 1877, a period known as Reconstruction, the fight for racial justice continued. Practices like poll taxes, which required individuals to pay to vote, and grandfather clauses, which required individuals' grandfathers to have been able to vote prior to the Civil War, were examples of intentional ways in which formerly enslaved peoples were prevented from voting and exercising their full rights. Significant inequalities continued into the 1900s, and people of color were prevented from accessing the same social, economic, and political rights as white Americans. Jim Crow laws were adopted across the United States and included examples like segregation, which we've learned drew distinctions between racial groups in everything from restaurants and schools to the use of public drinking fountains. The civil rights movement was created in direct response to these historical and continued injustices and included different philosophical approaches to these issues, numerous leaders, and the collective action of many to make significant changes. As we've mentioned, Martin Luther King Jr. took a nonviolent approach to activism and engaged with large groups of activists. For example, King and other members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, helped organize the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. After Rosa Parks had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus to a white passenger, this network of activists refused to take the bus themselves, and this boycott lasted 381 days. This massive protest set the stage for future collective activism, and in 1956, federal courts ruled that laws segregating buses were unconstitutional. The Freedom Riders also used collective action to bring attention to segregated bus stations across the South. This group of Black and white activists participated in freedom rides, bus trips taken across Southern states in 1861. These groups were met with horrific violence at the hands of white counter-protesters for trying to use public stations and white-only restrooms and lunch counters. Others were even arrested. However, they continued and expanded their protests across state lines and successfully helped pressure the Interstate Commerce Commission into prohibiting segregation in interstate transit terminals. In addition to activists from various ethnic and racial backgrounds, the civil rights movement showed that anyone, regardless of their age, can make a difference. Following the desegregation of public schools in 1954, a group of 9 Black high school students enrolled at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Although school segregation had been made illegal, they were initially prevented from entering into the school. Their heroic acts enlisted the help of President Dwight D. Eisenhower to send federal troops to escort them to school and gained national attention. However, not everyone involved in the civil rights movement believed that nonviolent resistance was the ultimate approach. Malcolm X, another leader in the civil rights movement, called activists to defend themselves when they were met with violence and aggression at the hands of counter-protesters and police. Malcolm X was also a supporter of Black nationalism and for a period of time was a member and a minister, Muslim minister in the Nation of Islam. As an American Muslim minister, his personal and spiritual philosophies evolved over time, and he also helped found the Organization of Afro-American Unity. With this information as your historical context, I'll now turn it over to Emily to discuss contemporary advocacy and strategies that you can use to become more engaged.
For advocacy and engagement, it can seem like you have to do something huge in order to make a difference. You may feel that you need to participate in a march or become the leader of a movement to become an activist. However, that is not always the case. Everyday activism presents itself in small steps and leads to large changes. In the packets, we have included a recommended list of books and films that can help you open a conversation about racial injustice with others, organizations you can join, or it can inspire you to begin one of your own. There are also other strategies for advocacy and engagement. In order to make positive change, we need to take control of the narrative. That means talking to people, particularly when you do not want to or the topic seems uncomfortable. That is not to say that you need to open a dialogue with random strangers, but rather the people you see every day. It is easy to call out a stranger on the internet. It is much harder and braver to have these discussions with friends or relatives. Consistently and proactively having open dialogues about racism and other forms of oppression in the United States is one of the ways you continue to learn about and challenge racial injustice. Some excellent books to read with small children are Whistle for Willie by Ezra Jack Keats and Solway by Lupita Nyong'o. For discussions for teenagers and adults, there's The Hate You Give by Angie Thompson and Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Some documentaries are 13th and Paris is Burning. Social activists to keep an eye on and follow are Dr. Angela Davis, who does a lot on the penal system in the United States, and Rachel E. Cargyle, who looks at racism and feminism and the intersectionality of those two, and did a lecture series on that. There's also the NAACP, Detroit Justice Center, Black Lives Matter, and the Equal Justice Initiative to look at and follow and learn more about. Now, for additional strategies, follow a podcast, look to your elected officials, and volunteer or donate in your local community. However, these are all ways to start the conversation. Do not just watch, read, or follow them. Watch, read, follow, and then talk to people about them. Get into the conversation. Start a dialogue with your friends and family. Think about it and then talk to people. The most important thing in activism is to not get complacent. Remember to stand up and say something. Make sure you engage your community today and the next day. Now, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and thank you so much.
In conclusion, we hope that this presentation helped provide you with helpful information about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy and the civil rights movement, and provided you with helpful strategies to see yourself as an empowered activist and agent for positive change in your own community. We're looking forward to seeing your creative submissions to the Collective Art Project. Thank you.